The world is watching the United States fall apart in slow motion right now. And I do not mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that every single country that is a competitor or an adversary of the United States is literally studying what is happening, taking notes, and moving. China is moving, Russia is moving, and Donald Trump is standing in the middle of all of it, doing one thing consistently: blinking. We are going to go through everything that is happening right now, because the scope of this is bigger than most people realize, and it is accelerating. Start with Bloomberg's reporting on something that should be alarming every person in this country. Xi Jinping has been closely and carefully studying how Trump has handled the U.S. conflict with Iran, specifically to identify the United States' weaknesses. And the reason China is doing this so intently right now is Taiwan. That is the lens through which Beijing is watching every development in the Middle East. Here is what China is seeing. The United States shifted its military attention and resources out of Asia and into the Middle East, where Trump started this conflict with Iran that has no clear endpoint. And Iran has demonstrated something in this conflict that the entire world has clocked. Iran has shown escalation dominance over Donald Trump. Trump pushed, Iran pushed back harder, and Trump blinked. China saw that. Russia saw that. Every government on the planet with a strategic interest in how the United States behaves saw that. Trump's forces struck the South Pars energy facility in Iran. Iran retaliated against Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. Iran then struck the Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas facilities in Qatar, one of the most important energy infrastructure sites on Earth. And then, almost immediately, Trump started backpedaling. Suddenly, the South Pars strike was not really his call. He was practically asking Iran to calm down. He was threatening Qatar to behave without any credible follow-through. That is called blinking. And when you blink like that in front of the entire world, the message is received loud and clear. You can be moved, you can be pressured, you will back down. Right now, Chinese naval vessels are moving up toward the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is letting them through. You understand what that means, right? That is China physically inserting its presence into the most strategically critical waterway on the planet, while the United States is distracted, overextended, and has already shown it will not escalate. And Iran is working with Russia on resupply for drone production. Iran was providing Russia with Shahed drones. Russia is now returning the supply chain favor by sending Iran components to build more. That loop is running right now while Trump figures out who to blame next. Let us talk about Japan, because this is where the economic consequences of this conflict become impossible to ignore. If you went to a gas station in Japan this week, you would see a sign that says, "Sorry, out of gasoline." And I want to be clear, that is a real photograph, not edited, not staged. Real gas stations in Japan are physically out of gasoline. Japan's Prime Minister has announced emergency government subsidies to keep the national average retail price of gasoline at around 170 yen per liter. Emergency government subsidies. In Japan. Right now. Does this remind you of anything? Because the way this started in Asia and is beginning to move, it is very similar to the early stage of something that starts out there and then makes its way to the rest of the world, before most people have processed what is coming. The energy crisis in Asia right now is not contained, it is expanding. Thailand has banned most oil exports and imposed domestic price controls. The Thai government is telling people to work from home, reduce travel. Japan and South Korea are tapping into their national stockpiles. Southeast Asian countries are widely exposed right now. The entire region is in emergency mode. Oil is over $110 a barrel, and that is where it sits while the conflict is at this stage. If this escalates further, that number goes higher. You already know how bad gasoline prices are getting in the United States right now. The rate of increase has been sudden and steep. But what is happening in Asia right now is the part that comes before what hits America. That is what people need to understand. The shortages showing up at pumps in Japan are not Japan's problem. They are the early indicator of what is moving in this direction. And now, here is the part that should be a complete five-alarm situation, but is getting buried under everything else. Russia is heading into Cuba. Let me say that one more time. Russia is heading into Cuba. 2 Russian ships carrying oil and gas are on their way to Cuba right now, in direct defiance of U.S. pressure and sanctions. This is the kind of thing that, under any previous American administration, would have completely dominated the news cycle. Cuba. Russian ships. Defying American sanctions openly. sailing right past the line. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened because the United States once stood up to Russia and held that line. Today, Russia is just going around it because they see that the United States is stretched, distracted, and led by someone they have clearly decided is not going to do anything serious about it. These shipments are going to Cuba because Cuba is in the middle of a severe energy crisis. There was a nationwide blackout. Hospitals and transport systems have been under enormous strain. And now Russia walks in and fills the gap in America's backyard, openly. Here is the part that connects directly to everything else. Trump removed oil sanctions from Russia. That decision allowed Russia to generate enormous energy profits, and those profits are exactly what funds Russia's ability to keep supplying Iran with drone components. Iran was supplying Russia with Shahed drones. Russia is now returning the favor with parts for more drone production. Trump removed the sanctions that would have constrained that entire loop. He funded the chain that is now supplying the weapons being used in this conflict. That is not an exaggeration. That is the sequence of events. The latest figure being discussed for a military supplemental is around $200 billion, $200 billion, while American families are being crushed by energy costs. While the purchasing power of ordinary Americans is falling, Russia is the main financial beneficiary of the conflict Trump started, and it is using those profits to expand its influence from Iran all the way to Cuba. And you think Venezuela's government is not in the same conversation? Of course they are. Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, they are all working from the same playbook right now. And they are doing it because they see an opening. They see what everyone else sees. A United States that has shown it will blink. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz was direct about where Europe stands on all of this. Washington did not consult Germany. Trump did not declare European support necessary. He did not ask for it. He told them he did not need them. Merz said they would have advised against following this path in the way it has been followed. That is Germany, one of America's core post-war partners, saying publicly and clearly, "We think this was a mistake, and we would have said so if anyone had asked us." Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, with Zelensky right there in the room, said Spain and Europe will not forget Ukraine, will not let this distract from that commitment. While Trump is walking away from the alliance structures that European security has depended on for decades, Spain is standing in front of Zelensky and making a direct promise. That contrast is not accidental. That message was aimed at multiple audiences, and every one of them understood it. Now here is the part that really puts everything in context. Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi was the main mediator between the United States and Iran when talks were happening in late February. And I mean serious talks. The UK's National Security Advisor was in the room. People who were present say there was a major breakthrough. A deal was basically within reach. Iran had agreed to no future nuclear enrichment. Strong verification protocols. Iran gave Washington essentially what Washington had been asking for. A deal in principle was close. Back to the story. The American negotiators in those talks were Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Here is what the Omani Foreign Minister and the UK National Security Advisor both described. These two were not operating as independent American negotiators, pushing for American interests. They were essentially proxies for someone else's agenda. They were not the ones doing the heavy diplomatic work. The actual substance of those talks was being driven by the Omani Foreign Minister and others present. And while that was happening, Witkoff and Kushner were apparently showing off their shoes to the Iranian negotiators. Trump has a habit of buying members of his circle a particular brand of footwear and expecting them to wear it whether it fits or not. His chief negotiators showed up to one of the most consequential diplomatic sessions in years and spent time comparing shoes with the people across the table. And yet somehow, despite all of that, a deal was within arm's reach that same night. The forces pushing Trump toward escalation said Iran was so weakened by sanctions and internal pressure that a swift military operation would produce a rapid, unconditional surrender. Trump agreed. Talks over. Strikes began. The unconditional surrender never came. Here is what the Omani foreign minister wrote in The Economist about what happened next and why. Iran's retaliation against what it calls American targets on the territory of its neighbors was an inevitable, if deeply regrettable, and completely unacceptable result. Faced with what was described as a conflict designed to terminate the Islamic Republic, This was probably the only rational option available to the Iranian leadership. The effects are felt most acutely on the southern side of the Gulf, where Arab countries that trusted American security cooperation now experience that cooperation as an acute vulnerability, threatening their present security and future prosperity. Plans Gulf states had for becoming a global hub for data centers, for building economies around tourism, aviation, and technology, may need to be entirely reconsidered. This man was America's chosen mediator. His country was struck by Iranian drones. He had every reason to stand behind the American position. And he is writing in The Economist that America turned its Gulf allies into something like the tenants of a landlord who burns the building down. Every arrangement, every long-term economic bet those countries made based on American partnership is now in question because of decisions made in Washington without consulting any of them. He went further. He called it an uncomfortable truth that America has lost control of its own foreign policy. And he asked the question that defines where this whole situation stands now. How can Iran return to dialogue with an administration that twice switched abruptly from talks to strikes and targeted elimination? The answer is that it essentially cannot. When negotiations are used as intelligence windows and as opportunities to set up eliminations, no government with institutional memory agrees to sit across that table again. The diplomats who spent years building that opening watched it close, and the people who closed it are still acting like they won something. In other words, Trump walked into an arrangement that took decades to build, one that actually served American strategic interests in the region, and he ran it into the ground the same way a reckless operator dismantles a business he never understood, walked away from the wreckage, blamed everyone else. This gets even more concrete when you look at what happened to Ali Larijani. Iran's national security advisor was eliminated 2 days ago, and the reaction was celebratory from the people pushing this conflict forward. But that reaction tells you they have absolutely no strategy for what comes next. Look, Larijani was not a moderate by Western standards, but within the Iranian system he understood the value of diplomacy and had at least demonstrated a capacity to engage with it. He was one of the last figures in that government that outside parties could realistically have a serious conversation with. Now his replacement is coming, and the name circulating is Saeed Jalili. If you want to know how different Jalili is from Larijani, the answer is very different, and not in a direction that helps anyone looking for a way out of this. This is not speculation about Iranian internal politics. This is the pattern that repeats every single time targeted elimination is used as a substitute for actual strategy in this region. Iran does not become more flexible when its officials are taken out. It becomes less flexible. And the replacement is almost always someone whose entire political identity is defined by rejecting whatever the removed official was willing to consider. The same logic applies at the very top of the Iranian leadership structure. The supreme leader goes, his son, Mojtaba, steps in. Harder line by any available measure. Iran has built 3 to 7 prepared replacements into every significant position in the system. You eliminate one pragmatist, you get a hardliner. You eliminate that hardliner, you get someone even further along that spectrum. Every operation that takes out someone capable of dialogue is an investment in making Iran's leadership more extreme. And right now, the United States is funding that investment with its own military resources. Now here is where the military picture stands right now. The United States has already deployed 5,000 additional troops. There is a Marine Expeditionary Unit that was repositioned directly from Japan and is heading to the region. That is 5,000 service members pulled out of the Pacific Theater at the exact moment China is studying American vulnerabilities and moving its own naval assets toward the Strait of Hormuz. The Pacific is less covered today than it was before this conflict started. China knows that. They knew it before the troops moved. They are watching it happen. And there are thousands more troops being discussed on top of the 5,000 already committed. Because here is what is now being openly talked about inside the Trump administration. A ground campaign into Iran, not just operations around the Strait of Hormuz, an actual ground operation along the Iranian coastline. Just let that land for a second. A ground campaign into Iran. These are not intelligent people running this operation. I am saying that plainly, not as an insult, but as an assessment based on what they have demonstrated. They do not plan ahead. They do not understand the facts on the ground. They are easily outmaneuvered. Look at what has happened step by step. They telegraphed every move. They used negotiations to telegraph their intentions. They eliminated officials and created worse replacements. They pulled assets from the Pacific and handed China a strategic gift. And now they are talking about a ground campaign in a country of 65 million people, with a decentralized military, established regional networks from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq, and a population that, regardless of how it feels about its own government, will resist a foreign ground operation in ways that would make previous Middle East campaigns look straightforward by comparison. The mushroom clouds over Saudi Arabia, the mushroom clouds over Qatar, and Trump's response to all of it is posting that U.S. allies need to get a grip and step up in this conflict, while also saying he is not afraid of a Vietnam-style ground engagement in Iran. He dodged Vietnam, but he is ready to send other people's kids in on the ground in Iran. That tells you everything. All of this is happening at the same time. $110 oil and rising, gas stations running dry in Japan and spreading through Southeast Asia toward the United States. Russia openly sailing ships into Cuba in defiance of American sanctions, while collecting the profits from the oil price spike Trump's conflict created and using those profits to resupply drone production. China repositioning toward the Strait of Hormuz, studying every vulnerability, calculating Taiwan. A peace agreement in late February that was essentially complete, destroyed in one night by forces pushing Trump toward escalation. Iran's most capable diplomatic figures eliminated and replaced by people with zero interest in any negotiated resolution. 5,000 troops out of the Pacific, with thousands more potentially following. A ground campaign into a 65 million person country being discussed by people who still cannot explain who fills the leadership positions they keep eliminating. And a president who authorized a major strike on Iranian energy infrastructure, and then, the moment the consequences hit, publicly blamed the ally he did it with. That is not a stumble. That is a pattern. That is what you get when a government replaces strategy with improvisation and replaces honest assessment with loyalty tests and wishful thinking. The Omani foreign minister said, "America's friends have a responsibility to tell the truth." He is right. The truth is that America's Gulf allies are exposed and suffering from a conflict they did not want and cannot benefit from. America's European partners were not consulted and would have pushed back. America's adversaries are reading the board clearly and acting on what they see. And the American people are about to feel all of it, at the pump, in prices, and in the cost of a military operation that has no exit in sight. That is where we are.